What if everything you have been told about what lies beneath the Vatican is incomplete? What if there is not one tomb, but two? The first tomb contains a fallen angel. The second, according to older traditions, was prepared for Cain, the first human to kill, and the first to carry something humanity was never meant to inherit. The first tomb is already familiar. We have spoken of it before. The iron casket bound with 7 chains, each forged from a different metal, each etched with sigils from the Ars Goetia, the 72 entities said to have once served the prisoner sealed inside. That prisoner has not moved in 16 centuries. Lucifer, the morning star, the light-bearer, the first rebel. But the more unsettling detail, the one rarely emphasized, is that those chains were never truly intended to restrain him. They were meant to identify him, to confirm what had been sealed inside rather than to guarantee it would never leave. The second tomb sits in the adjacent chamber, not in the prison itself, but in what has come to be called the antechamber. It is a circular room carved from black basalt so dense it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. There are no windows, and only one entrance. The air inside is unnaturally cold, heavy, and still, the kind of stillness that suggests preservation rather than abandonment. The conditions do not feel accidental. They feel maintained, as though something in that room still requires stability, still requires protection from decay. At the center of the chamber stands a throne of black stone, massive and austere, stripped of ornament, comfort, or symbolism. It was not built for ceremony or authority. It was built for vigilance, and directly across from that throne, set into the wall with deliberate precision, sits the second tomb. It is smaller than Lucifer's casket, but constructed from iron that appears significantly older. Metallurgical analysis, unofficial of course, suggests the alloy predates Roman smelting, predates Etruscan metallurgy, predates any civilization that should have possessed the knowledge to create such material on the Italian peninsula. The surface is scarred with rust, yet beneath that superficial corrosion, the metal remains dense, stable, almost untouched by time, as though decay itself had been anticipated and engineered against. Covering the surface of the tomb is a repeated inscription rendered in 22 languages. Some are known, some are extinct, and some do not correspond to any linguistic record preserved above ground. Yet the message is always the same. The vessel awaits the breath. Beneath those words are 72 sigils, identical to those engraved on the chains of Lucifer's prison next door. Their geometry, placement, and wear patterns match with unsettling precision. This is not coincidence. It is design, which raises questions far more troubling than the existence of Lucifer's tomb alone. Why would the same seals mark both the prisoner and a neighboring sarcophagus? Why position a throne to face that second tomb rather than the iron casket itself? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if that tomb was built to contain something, why Cain? And why in such close proximity to Satan himself? So the question we're investigating isn't whether Cain existed. It's whether something connected to him was deliberately preserved beneath the Vatican, and why that preservation may still matter today. The answer is older than Rome, older than Jerusalem, older than any city that ever carved its name into stone. It begins in a field, 2 brothers, 1 altar, 1 offering accepted, 1 refused. Abel brought blood, Cain brought grain. The text says God favored Abel's sacrifice, and Cain's expression changed. His face fell. His posture tightened. Something shifted long before the violence began. What followed has always been described simply as the first murder, but the language of Genesis is more precise than that. It says Cain rose up against Abel, not merely struck him, rose up, as if the action began somewhere deeper than muscle or intention. Cain struck once. The blow staggered Abel, but did not kill him. Cain struck again, then again, then again, until the field that had grown food became the first place on earth to absorb human blood spilled by human hands. When it was over, Abel lay motionless, his blood seeping into soil that had never held it before. And Cain looked down at his own hands with a reaction the text does not fully describe, but strongly implies. Recognition mixed with unfamiliarity. as though what he saw there did not entirely belong to him. Early Jewish commentaries, particularly fragments associated with the Book of Enoch and later rabbinical expansions, hint at something the canonical text leaves unsaid. They suggest the first act of human violence was not spontaneous. It was catalytic. A threshold moment. The first time something external found entry into human blood through deliberate violence. Not possession in the theatrical sense, not demonic control, but corruption. Subtle, biological, inheritable. This interpretation reframes God's response. God does not execute Cain, he marks him. Traditionally, that mark has been interpreted as protection, preventing others from killing him in revenge. But several early theological schools argued the opposite. They believed the mark functioned as containment. Not protecting Cain from humanity, but protecting humanity from what Cain had become. Something had changed inside him that could not simply die with him. Something that would persist if allowed to disperse freely. Cain is exiled eastward into the land of Nod. He builds a city, takes a wife, raises children. Scripture gives their names briefly before the narrative moves on. Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, Lamech. 7 generations associated with the first bloodline touched by violence. Then comes the flood, an event presented as a global reset, washing corruption from the earth. But the timing raises an uncomfortable detail. By the time the waters rise, Cain himself is no longer accounted for. The text never describes his death. It never describes his burial. He simply disappears from the record. That silence has fueled speculation for centuries. Some traditions claim he died naturally. Others claim he wandered until his body failed. But a smaller, more persistent line of interpretation suggests something else entirely, that Cain did not vanish by accident. He was removed. Deliberately. Because if the first act of murder introduced corruption into the human line, then allowing its original carrier to die uncontrolled might have risked spreading it beyond containment. Which leads to the question this investigation now has to confront. If Cain did not simply disappear into history, who took him, and where was he taken? Scripture tells us Cain was exiled. It does not tell us how his story ended. There is no account of his death, no burial place, no passing mention of where the first murderer finally fell. For a figure whose act reshaped human moral history, that silence is unusually complete. Ancient writers noticed it early. Jewish commentators questioned it. Later, Christian scholars quietly debated it. Some concluded he died forgotten. Others believed the flood erased him. But a smaller, more persistent tradition argued something far less comfortable. Cain did not simply disappear. He was removed. This interpretation begins with the assumption that what entered Cain in the field did not leave when the violence ended. Early theological fragments, particularly material attributed to lost Enochic commentaries and suppressed patristic notes, suggest the first act of deliberate human bloodshed created a threshold event. Violence was no longer theoretical. It had manifested physically. And something, whether spiritual corruption, psychological contagion, or a force not easily categorized, attached itself to the first human willing to cross that boundary. If that interpretation holds, allowing Cain to die naturally might not have eliminated the corruption. It might have dispersed it. That possibility reframes the mark placed upon him. Traditionally interpreted as protection, it begins to look more like identification. A way of ensuring Cain remained visible, traceable, separated from ordinary human movement. Some early sects believed the mark allowed both heaven and certain earthly custodians to monitor him. Not constantly, not invasively, but enough to know where the original carrier of human violence existed at any given time. And then, at some point before the flood narrative reaches its conclusion, those traces stop. Cain is no longer recorded. No descendant claims direct lineage. No burial tradition survives. It is as though someone deliberately closed the historical record. That is where the more controversial tradition begins. It suggests that pre-Christian priesthoods, particularly those operating around early Mediterranean cult centers, inherited fragments of knowledge about Cain's condition. They did not necessarily understand it fully, but they understood enough to fear it. Enough to believe the first murderer represented not just past violence, but an ongoing biological or spiritual risk to future humanity. Rome was not yet Rome when these groups first gathered around the hill that would later hold the Vatican. Archaeology confirms ritual activity there long before Christianity, long before Imperial Rome. Small cult sites, burial zones, restricted chambers whose purposes remain unclear. Most historians attribute them to ordinary religious practice. A minority interpretation suggests something more specific. Early containment traditions passed from culture to culture, gradually absorbed into what would later become institutional Christianity. If Cain reached those priesthoods, voluntarily or otherwise, they may have faced a decision few human institutions ever confront. Do you destroy what you fear, risking unintended consequences? Or do you preserve it under controlled conditions? Several ancient cultures chose preservation when destruction seemed uncertain. Sacred relics, dangerous texts, even diseased remains were sometimes isolated rather than eliminated. Containment was seen as safer than experimentation. That is where Lucifer re-enters the discussion, not as captor, but as catalyst. Some suppressed theological writings suggest Lucifer's rebellion was not simply celestial defiance, but the introduction of destabilizing knowledge into creation. Knowledge that eventually manifested in human behavior. If Cain represented the first successful human vessel of that corruption, Lucifer would not need to imprison him. Recognition alone would be sufficient. Identification, exposure. After that, human institutions, priesthoods, rulers, later churches, would act according to their own survival instincts. By the time Christianity consolidated authority in Rome, the Vatican inherited layers of prior tradition. Pagan ritual sites, burial complexes, localized cult secrecy. If something had already been preserved beneath that hill, the emerging church may have chosen continuity rather than disruption. Seal it. Monitor it. Incorporate the knowledge quietly into theological frameworks without public acknowledgement. That would explain why the antechamber appears older than the Christian basilica above it, yet maintained long after Christianity took control. It would explain the throne facing the second tomb, suggesting observation rather than worship. It would explain why environmental controls remain active even today, despite official silence about what they preserve. And it raises the central question this investigation cannot avoid. If Cain was not simply exiled, but deliberately contained, possibly because of a corruption first recognized in connection with Lucifer's rebellion, then what exactly was preserved beneath the Vatican? A body, a relic, or something that was never meant to die at all? If Cain was deliberately removed rather than forgotten, the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was preserved, and why would anyone choose preservation over destruction? Ancient institutions rarely kept dangerous relics out of curiosity alone. Preservation usually implied utility, risk management, or fear of unintended consequences. The traditions surrounding the antechamber suggest all three may have been at play. The architectural details matter. The throne in that chamber does not face Lucifer's iron tomb. It faces the smaller sarcophagus. That orientation has never been satisfactorily explained. If Lucifer were the primary threat, logic suggests observation would focus on him. Yet the physical design directs attention elsewhere. The throne implies vigilance, not reverence. Its austerity suggests duty, not ceremony. Someone, at some point, believed sustained observation of the second tomb was necessary. Early Vatican administrative fragments, many heavily redacted, reference rotating custodial roles assigned to individuals who never appeared in official clerical records. Some historians interpret this as monastic isolation practices. Others believe it points to a discrete internal order tasked with maintaining sites considered sensitive or doctrinally complicated. None of the surviving documents explicitly mention Cain, but several refer obliquely to the original vessel, or the first bearer. The language is careful, indirect, almost clinical. That terminology aligns with a less mystical interpretation of Cain's legacy. Instead of viewing him purely as a moral archetype, some early theologians treated the first murder as a formative human event that introduced a replicable pattern of violence into human society. In modern terms, we might call it behavioral contagion, inherited trauma, or even genetic predisposition. Ancient writers lacked those categories, so they described it as corruption, spirit, or stain. Regardless of vocabulary, the concern was continuity. Once violence entered humanity, could it ever be fully removed? Lucifer's role in this framework becomes less theatrical but more unsettling. Rather than actively imprisoning Cain, he becomes the precedent for rebellion, the first fracture in cosmic order. Cain becomes the human echo of that fracture, celestial defiance reflected in human action. If institutions believed that connection carried ongoing risk, preserving the original carrier might have seemed safer than allowing uncontrolled dispersion through death, decomposition, or ritual mishandling. This may also explain why the antechamber environment remains controlled. Low temperature slows biological decay. Reduced humidity prevents corrosion, microbial growth, and chemical instability. These are preservation conditions, not ceremonial ones. Even without a visible body, the space behaves like a containment facility. Something about that tomb is treated as materially significant, not purely symbolic. The throne complicates matters further. A throne implies occupancy, not constant occupancy perhaps, but anticipated occupancy. Historical whispers suggest periods when someone sat there, not to worship, not to pray, but to watch. Some accounts describe long-term assignments lasting years. Others mention temporary vigils during periods of geopolitical or ecclesiastical instability. The details are inconsistent, but the pattern is persistent. Observation intensified when institutions felt threatened. If the watchers existed, their function may have been psychological as much as physical. Observation itself can be a stabilizing act. Modern containment science recognizes this principle. Monitoring reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty increases risk. Ancient institutions may have reached similar conclusions through experience rather than experiment. The most unsettling implication, however, concerns timing. Reports of active observation taper off dramatically in the late 19th century, coinciding with major political upheaval in Rome and the restructuring of church administrative priorities. Since then, references to the antechamber become sparse, indirect, often buried in maintenance documentation rather than theological discourse. Environmental controls remain, but overt custodial language fades, which leaves a final, uncomfortable question as we move forward. If the throne once existed for vigilance, and if vigilance has diminished while preservation continues, are we looking at a chamber that still contains something, or a chamber that is waiting for something to return? If Cain was removed rather than forgotten, and if the chamber beneath the Vatican was constructed to observe rather than worship, then the remaining question becomes technical rather than theological. What exactly is being preserved? The environmental conditions inside the antechamber are not symbolic. Temperature held just below freezing. Humidity kept low enough to prevent organic degradation. Air circulation filtered, controlled, consistent. These are the same principles used in modern archival science when the goal is long-term stabilization of fragile material. Manuscripts, biological specimens, archaeological remains, items considered too important or too dangerous to allow uncontrolled decay. Officially, the Vatican maintains climate-controlled vaults for relics and historical documents. Unofficially, some maintenance records refer to deeper sub-basement sectors with environmental requirements that exceed archival necessity. The language is careful. Organic stabilization, material integrity preservation, restricted access. None of it names a subject. None of it explains why preservation remains a priority centuries after any presumed burial. One interpretation is straightforward. Institutions preserve what they fear losing. But another interpretation, quieter and less comfortable, suggests institutions also preserve what they fear releasing. The difference between a relic and a containment object is often only intent. Early Christian writers occasionally referenced Cain in unusually clinical terms. Not simply sinner or exile, but carrier, bearer, even vessel. Those words recur often enough to suggest more than metaphor. They imply something transmitted, something sustained beyond a single lifetime. History rarely announces its most consequential decisions. They accumulate quietly. A sealed chamber here, a restricted archive there, a maintenance protocol renewed without discussion. Over centuries, silence becomes policy. Policy becomes assumption, and assumption becomes forgetting. The antechamber sits at the intersection of several such silences. A tomb attributed to Lucifer that is acknowledged but never discussed. A second tomb whose purpose remains undefined. Environmental controls that persist without public explanation. Architectural features, the throne, the orientation, the layered construction phases that suggest deliberate design rather than incidental development. Individually, each element can be explained. Together, they form a pattern that resists simple dismissal. Cain's story occupies a similar space, universally known, yet abruptly unfinished, marked but not executed, exiled but not buried, present in moral teaching, absent in historical conclusion. If his disappearance coincided with emerging priesthoods concerned about inherited corruption, the possibility of deliberate containment becomes difficult to ignore entirely, even if definitive proof remains elusive. Lucifer's connection complicates the narrative further, not as captor, not as jailer, but as precedent, the first fracture mirrored in human behavior. If early institutions interpreted Cain as evidence that rebellion could move from celestial myth into human biology or psychology, preserving the original case study would have seemed prudent. Dangerous, perhaps, but manageable under controlled conditions. That control may never have required constant supervision, but it likely required awareness. Awareness that something significant lay beneath the foundations of what would become one of the world's most influential religious centers. Awareness that preservation without understanding carries risk. Today we know environmental stabilization continues. We know documentation exists, though access remains restricted. We know architectural evidence suggests the antechamber was designed for observation before it was absorbed into later Christian structures. What we do not know is whether the original rationale for that observation is still remembered. And that uncertainty is where this investigation leaves us. Because if Cain truly represented the first successful human vessel of inherited corruption, and if early institutions chose preservation over destruction, then one final question remains. Not theological, not historical, but contemporary. Is the chamber beneath the Vatican still preserving something, or simply waiting for the moment preservation is no longer enough? Which leaves us with one unavoidable possibility. Whatever decision was made centuries ago to preserve rather than destroy may never have truly ended. It may simply have shifted into silence. And if silence is still being maintained, the question is no longer what was sealed beneath the Vatican, but whether anyone still knows why. In our next video investigation, we turn to the Watchers, the individuals historically assigned to observe that chamber, why their role appears to have vanished, and what surviving records suggest may have happened the last time someone officially sat in the throne facing that second tomb. And if you want deeper analysis, extended research breakdowns, and the full uncensored direction of this investigation, consider joining the channel membership. That's where the real continuation of this story happens.